This quiz entails just a couple of types of questions. There's a page of short answer, and then there's a page of matching references with their prophecies. And so this, of course, deals with the archaeological section that we dealt with, and then we started into some of the prophetic sections there of the Bible. And so these questions deal with that. Once again, especially with the archaeology, some of the questions won't actually be stuff in the fundamentals as much as some of the stuff that I went over, all right? And so you'll want to know some of these different archaeological events, all right? What archaeological discovery dealt with the fall of man? And of course, we mentioned that bronze tree of Sangxingwu, all right? Don't worry, I won't count for spelling, all right? But the bronze tree, and that was found in China. And of course, we mentioned that. We talked about Belshazzar, and we talked several things. Of course, many people didn't believe that he was a historical character. And we talked about the Bible story there, that some of the things that we found out. Of course, it was the Nabonidus cylinder that told us that Belshazzar did actually exist. That was the archaeology find that proved that. Later on, we found a Nabonidus chronicle that actually talked about Babylon falling during a big pagan feast. And so both of those, the cylinder, Nabonidus cylinder, gave us Belshazzar's existence. The Nabonidus chronicle gave us the feast. And by the way, it's interesting that, of course, the Nabonidus cylinder tells us that Belshazzar was the co-king with his father Nabonidus, which is obviously makes it reasonable why he offered Daniel third place in the kingdom and not second place in the kingdom, because he was second place. All right. We talked also about the archaeology, the thing called Lot's wife, and whether, of course, the picture I showed you was Lot's wife or not, we don't know. But we did mention several different historical characters, ancient writers who actually said, we saw the pillar of salt being Lot's wife. And I gave you a couple. We had Josephus, Clement, Irenaeus, and Theodosius. So 4 different men who said, we've actually seen Lot's wife, all right, the pillar of salt there. We also talked about the Laches letters, and those were, of course, clay tablets that were written between 2 military officials, and they were written at the time in which Jerusalem was falling. And of course, the Laches letters talk a little bit about a prophet, probably Jeremiah. It could have been Uriah or Hananiah or one of those other prophets, but definitely talked about the fall of cities that were written about in the book of Jeremiah. We also talked about the different flood legends, and you'll want to know that there are approximately 270 different flood legends. And we mentioned several different ones. One of the really important ones was one given to us by the Toltec Indians. And what makes that one kind of important is the Toltec Indians actually say there was so much time before the flood, which matches very closely to what the Bible says. And then it also talks about the fact that after the flood, there was a big tower built and there was a confusion of languages. And so we see the Tower of Babel as well. We mentioned Egypt in prophecy. We talked about the fact that there has been some uncovering in a town called Avaris, Egypt, in which there is a statue that's found in a pyramid tomb. And that statue has a coat of many colors, mushroom haircut, and the yellowish kind of skin, which Egyptians would use to designate a Semitic type person. And so we believe that probably is a Joseph statue. We also mentioned an Egyptian priest who wrote a group of admonitions that very nearly describes quite a bit of the plagues that happened in Egypt. And of course, we mentioned his name was Ippur, all right, and the admonition of Ippur. All right, we talked about the discovery of the Hittites, and of course, before the late 1800s, the Hittites were thought as a kind of a mythical people, and then we found their capital city and broke their language, and so the Hittites are now coming to our line of thinking. We mentioned the different kings in Genesis chapter 14. And one of those kings, Amraphel, has been pretty much identified with as Hammurabi. And of course, we mentioned that in several different of the fundamental writings. Talking about prophecies, some different verses, of course, that you'll want to note. Genesis 3:15, by the way, is the first prophecy found in the Bible. It's also a prophecy about the coming Messiah. The very first one, of course, the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head. We mentioned Genesis 9:26 and 27, talking about the Messiah would come from the lineage of Shem. We talked about Isaiah 7:14, the fact that it was a virgin that would bear a son named Emmanuel. Of course, Messiah would be born of a virgin. We mentioned Isaiah 9:6, that talks about the different names that Jesus was given. Of course, some of those names, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and so forth. We mentioned Isaiah 53, which foretells of the death of Christ by his own nation. It talks quite a bit about different things, including the fact that he made his grave with the rich, and of course he was buried in a rich man's grave. We mentioned Psalm 22. In Psalm 22, a very special point in prophecy. Of course, Psalm 22 tells us what Jesus was thinking while he was on the cross. It's also a pretty amazing prophecy in that it actually describes crucifixion about 1,000 years before Israel had ever even heard of crucifixion. So some pretty amazing prophecies there. We mentioned the prophecy of Cyrus the Persian, who allowed Israel to come back into the kingdom. And that's found in Isaiah 44:28 and chapter 45, verse 1. We mentioned Deuteronomy 28. It really talks about the sad history of Israel. It was all prophesied that they'd have kind of a sad history. And it does seem to also kind of give us a picture, very possibly, of the Roman Empire taking over Egypt, or taking over Israel. And then we mentioned, we finished off with Ezekiel 26 through chapter 28, the amazing prophecies of Tyrus. And of course, we talked about it was a multi-functioning, multi-segmented prophecy. It started with Nebuchadnezzar taking over the old city Tyrus, but not able to reach that island of Tyrus. And then later Alexander the Great coming through and actually taking all the material from old Tyrus, throwing it into the ocean, making a causeway out to the island, and conquering Tyrus. And of course, today Tyrus is not in existence, at least not where it was, and it is a place for the spreading of nets. All right, that is a good segment of what we will cover in this quiz. Hopefully, you study hard and get a good grade. God bless.